What I am about to tell you about Paul comes primarily from traditions about Paul, the earliest traditions I can find. And okay, brother, great to have you here. These traditions seem to fill in the gaps about Paul's life outside his writings. One of the great finds that I have lately discovered is that there are interpolations in the authentic books of Paul that changes his entire theology. Um, the stuff about women, he writes, not Paul. Interpolation. 6 of the books, not from Paul, which you can probably tell because the theology is so different. And I have written down 7 or 8 different ways to tell what is right with Paul's letters and what isn't. But if you were writing letters to somebody, first of all, how much of your life could you get from your letters? We don't know anything about his secular life unless we go to Pauline traditions. And the traditions tell us that Paul was born in Giscala of the Galilee, and that he was a close relative of the Herodians. He was a Herodian. His grandmother was Salome, Herod the Great's sister, and that his mother and his sister both married temple treasurers, very rich people, and that his father, Antipatris, was in the direct line of Herod, as I said, but probably the only Herod that didn't have a kingdom. We read about Paul's nephew in the scripture, in the New Testament. Paul's nephew was Julius Archelaus. He was the first man to purchase a copy of Josephus' writings, The War of the Jews, or Jewish War. We know of him. He has quite a lot. Josephus has a lot to say about him. And because he was a Herodian, he had enemies, big time. His family had enemies there in Galilee. In fact, you might remember that his cousin Antipas, Herod Antipas, got in a war with King Aretas of Damascus over Antipas's ditching of Aretas' daughter to marry Herodias, his brother's wife. He just ditched his wife, dumped her over in Machaerus in the Herodian fortress there. And what that caused was a war between Damascus and the Herodians. So, well, one thing about Paul, you think about them letting him down in a basket from Damascus. They were in the process of a war against his family. I don't think it was for preaching, and Paul never says it's for preaching. But he goes to Damascus like a wild man, and the only way he could get away without being murdered there is to be put down in the basket because he was a natural enemy. So King Aretas of Damascus thought. And it was the same way a generation before with Paul's parents. And they were they emigrated out of Galilee and they went to Tarsus. Tarsus was a major Greek city in Anatolia. It was situated in eastern Anatolia, not far from Constantinople, not far from Greece at all. And that was really, Tarsus was thought to be an entirely total Greek city, where the studies were of Greek philosophers. People believed in Greek gods. They worshiped in Greek temples. Everything there was Greek, the language, etc. Paul, in his writings, he quotes 13 times from Greek rhetoricians or philosophers. Most of those times are from the philosopher Seneca. And in fact, there are letters from Paul to Seneca and letters back from Seneca to Paul that we can read that outline just exactly how the emperor was feeling about Paul's writings, because Seneca was Nero's guardian for many years. And so we get some idea that Seneca, being over Nero, especially as a young man, he read the letters of Paul to both Nero and his wife Poppaea, whom he kicked to death and killed. And the letters between the two, they go into an understanding that at first Nero and Poppaea were reasonably well disposed to Paul's letters, but that as the letters continue, they, especially Poppaea, got more and more hostile with Paul's writings. And those letters end up with Seneca being ordered to go kill himself and his wife, which he did. So we see connections there with the imperial family. Also, with another imperial portion, one of Nero's top men named Epaphroditus. We read about Epaphroditus in Philippians 2 and 4. Epaphroditus was with Paul in his travels, and Epaphroditus was in Nero's council and was one of his secretaries and his freedmen. Epaphroditus was also, when Nero was cast out of office, the one that took Nero out of the capital when the people were all there to kill him, and snuck him out, took him down to his house, where Nero supposedly killed himself with Epaphroditus' help. That is to say, Nero couldn't push the dagger in, so he begged Epaphroditus to give it a shove, which he did. 30 years later, Epaphroditus, after working for 4 different emperors, was condemned by Domitian of killing Nero and put to death, when Epaphroditus was really a believer. And in the time of Domitian, if you were a believer or a quasi-Jew, you didn't live long, because he even killed his relatives. So he killed Epaphroditus and the one who was with Paul. And I believe that it was Epaphroditus who wrote the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, because the name Luke was put on there by nobody's knowledge of who wrote it. Simply, they put it on there because Luke is mentioned as a physician. Now, going back to Tarsus, let me want my throat. You want to know what books? Okay, the Pseudo-Paul books but you'll never hear this in church. But from your own readings, knowing what to look for, you'll confirm it yourself. Ephesians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus. There's one more. Well, those are the pseudo-Paul. Those are false books. I know there's one more. I'm not thinking of it now. The authoritative books are Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, 3 Corinthians, 1st and 2nd and 3rd Philippians. Yes, there are more than 2 letters or 1 letter in the Philippians. There's at least 3 letters there.
What about Thessalonians?
Thessalonians, you're right. 2nd Thessalonians is not original to him.
Okay.
But 1st Thessalonians is the earliest one that he wrote.
Which one talks about the rapture?
Both 1st and 2nd. But
okay.
The main one is 2nd, and 1st Thessalonians is like in 4, chapter 4, something like that. But I concede that the rapture did happen in 70 AD, and I believe that I can prove that, and it has a lot to do with Paul's prophecy, because Jesus and Paul both prophesied exactly when these things were going to happen.
Wow.
And they prophesied 40 years, 70 AD, and you might be surprised to find that the teacher of righteousness in the Dead Sea Scrolls also prophesied the same period of 40 years.
Does that mean the teacher of righteousness was either Jesus or Paul?
I think that the teacher of righteousness was probably James. And I think most of the Dead Sea Scrolls that we're most familiar with were written in the 1st century AD and have to do with Paul and Jesus and James and Ananias, the priest, and the Roman army and the rebellious Jews. And that probably the main book that talks about those is the Habakkuk Pesher. And I have several podcasts on that showing you who is who in that book. And it doesn't fit in history anyplace else, but it fits perfectly with the 1st century AD and the players that we mentioned. It fits perfectly. Habakkuk, Pesher. So let's see. As a Herodian, I talked a little about his, I mentioned his education. He was educated in the Greek way, of course. We don't know whether he was a worshiper in Greek temples or not. He was certainly familiar with those things because he grew up there. The question is, why did he go to Jerusalem? And this is another traditional story that it's kind of mind-blowing, really. When he got old enough, he considered Caiaphas. Caiaphas, the high priest in Jerusalem, was one of the supposed sons of Annas. Annas was the old high priest. 4 of his sons became high priests, and one of his sons-in-law. That son-in-law was Joseph Caiaphas, mentioned several times in the New Testament. Caiaphas became a high priest according to one provision. He married the daughter of the high priest, Annas. Now, Caiaphas' tomb came open within the last 10 years, and Caiaphas' daughter was in that tomb. And her name was probably Miriam or Maya, one of the two. And her ossuary or bone box along with that of Yosef Caiaphas, was found in the Caiaphas tomb. There's a lot of information on that, but that's all we need to know right now, because Paul got the idea, according to tradition, that he would be the high priest. It does sound like Paul, really. He's looking to be aggrandized as a famous, he says he's a Hebrew of Hebrews and of the Pharisees. Well, the Pharisees, he might have thought he was, but he talks about being a Pharisee in Galatians and some other places. His teaching is not Pharisaical at all when it comes to circumcision, etc. That's another story. Paul wanted to be the high priest in Jerusalem. So he set himself up as a young man to be a candidate to marry the high priest's daughter. That is Caiaphas's daughter. I'm sorry, I said Annas before. He thought he would be able to succeed Caiaphas. And he gets to Jerusalem and he's in that position. He's got lots of money then. His family hadn't disinherited him or anything yet. They would. But at this time, he brings this to the high priest. And the high priest, because Paul is a Herodian, Josephus said that nobody messed with him. He got his way in everything. In fact, Josephus tells us that Paul and his brother, Costobarus, were men who stirred up riots, and were despicable fellows. You can read about that in Josephus if you look up Saulos, Saulos, in the index, and you can read several places there where it talks about Saulos, which is Paul, and his brother Costobarus. Funny thing is, Costobarus, that's an awful lot like Barnabas. Costobar, son of Barnabas. We never know Joseph Barnabas' real name. Could it be Paul's brother? They almost seem like brothers at some time, but that's speculation. This is more true. What happened then with Caiaphas was that we have these Nazarenes causing all kinds of trouble. Everybody's going to these Nazarenes. They are having their meetings on the temple steps every day, just as it says in the New Testament. And I'm going to give you a mission. I want you to get rid of these people. And if you do, I will consider you to marry my daughter Mary. That was the deal that was to be made. So Paul goes on now with credentials to get after these guys. And in the Nazarene Acts, which is just as canonical as any other book I've ever seen, it's a different Acts of the Apostles that I published and translated. It's an Acts of the Apostles from the viewpoint of Peter instead of Paul. We have Paul here with Caiaphas, and across town at the temple, we have James the Just, with a whole group of people that wanted to be baptized. And he is on the top of the temple steps, and they're on the lower steps, and he's teaching from there about the meaning of baptism and the requirements of it. And that if they were to be baptized, this is what we need to do. We need to do teshuvah beforehand, and we need to have a fast for a couple of days. And then in the middle of this peaceful situation comes Paul and his gang, which is talked about again in Josephus. And one of the Paul and Costobarus, probably his brother, and these other gangs that Josephus talks about Paul being the leader of, or Saulos. He comes in there and he comes in like gangbusters with his group of people, and he yells at the crowd and he yells at the people looking and he yells at his own people and he says, "Look here, are we going to permit this religious folly right here on the temple steps?" And then it says, he took up the brazier. This is a piece of metal, heavy piece of metal. And he began to beat people with that. And then his group of people came on, got their weapons out and started beating the people that were on the temple steps. You're beaten by a brazier, you're not going to live. So Paul goes after James and beats him with a brazier. And James goes down the temple steps, lays there as dead at the bottom of the steps. And Paul goes off with a victory of sorts, having left some of them dead there and some alive and wounded, which this caused a massive exile of Nazarenes from Jerusalem. They were on their way to Jericho on the Damascus Road. And it turned out that James wasn't killed. He was nearly killed. His legs were broken. And it says that this is in the Nazarene Acts. If you want one, I'll send it to you. It says that they went back to James' house. And there they decided to leave town until this guy could get out. So they went toward Jericho. And Paul went after them, solos. He went after them with his gang on the Damascus Road. Well, James and his group broke off from that road to go to Jericho. And there they visited first the memorial of a couple of brothers who had been martyred for their faith, and that they had tombstones that would whiten of themselves every year. It would whiten of themselves. So they went to pay homage. We don't know who they were, but those tombstones were found a couple of years ago to add credibility to the story. Paul continued on the Damascus Road there. And Acts chapter 9 tells us that Paul had a conversion. But there's no attestation to that anyplace else. And in Acts, there are 3 times it talks about Paul on the Damascus Road and what happened. And all three accounts are very different. So the question is, do you trust the writer of Acts or Epaphroditus or whoever it is? Because something happened to Paul somewhere to change his mind about this, and his mind change ruined his chances at high priest. He became one of them. In fact, in your New Testament, it talks about talks with James, and the letters of Paul talk about speaking with James about this, that, and the other thing, and that Paul got the right foot of fellowship from them, and pretty much the disciples and elders there said, yeah, go up to the Gentiles, please get out of here, that kind of thing. If somebody had come and left you for dead, would you trust him? Would you trust him? There's a lot more to that, but I'm about finished here with this part. So our understanding is that Paul did not get married, although there's another tradition that says that the high priest's daughter finally married into the imperial family. I'm not sure about this one. This seems a little wild to me. But that Caiaphas' daughter was also named Poppaea, who was Nero's second wife, whom he kicked to death when she was pregnant with her first child. So that adds a lot to this of other crazy stuff to this story. Why did Paul go to Arabia? Why did Paul go to these other places? Well, there's a lot more to this, but I've got to tell you, I'm about done. This is part one. How's that sound? I want to be happy to tell you at another time those passages in the authentic Pauline letters that are interpolations that shouldn't be there. Because if you're one who doesn't like Paul, you're going to like him a whole lot more when you find out what he didn't write. Edmund, you are welcome. But I got to go to bed. It's been a long day for me and a long weekend. Come visit us in our service, 11 o'clock a.m. on Shabbat. That's Eastern time. I get to preach next time. Come on, come on, come on. Just zoom to this same channel right here and you'll be there. I'll love to see you. I'll send you a little gift.
Hey, where can we see the rest of the stuff about Paul?
Where can you see?
Yeah.
Well, I have a lot of information at jspresents.org,
Okay.
especially Paul and the Druids, Paul in Britain, Paul in Europe. There's a lot of stories about him that didn't even make it into the scripture because I don't know why. It should have made it in there. There's a whole chapter of Acts, Acts 29, that talks about Paul in Europe. Clear as high as Britain and Spain. You know, Paul always claimed he was going to go to Spain. Well, he did go to Spain, and there's a record of it in Acts 29, but for some reason they tore that out of your Bible. I don't know why.
Where do you get Acts 29?
Where you have to know where to get these texts. Yes, Edmund says that he read that. It's pretty convincing, I think, especially when you go a little farther and you read about the what do you call that? The Basilica, the Cathedral of St. Paul in London, and what went on there before it became the Basilica or Cathedral of St. Paul, that he stayed there, and there were a host of other Romans that we know from history that were there with him, including Roman senators, including Druids, and several other people that are identifiable from the New Testament. Thanks for the opportunity.